Sitefinity in Azure. So again, 8.2 released support for web apps, which was actually previously called Azure Websites. There was an issue with the way it worked, and Sitefinity had a conflict with websites, so it didn't actually allow you to use that. There were some workarounds that people were able to get through, but out of the box, it isn't supported. Now it is with 8.2. But these are really the 3 different options you have from an Azure deployment perspective. You have virtual machines, and that is no different than deploying to your own internal virtual machine that you have on your network. It's really just copy the files up to the Azure virtual machine. The only downside is you've got the benefit of being able to dynamically change the resources for that virtual machine, but you're not really taking advantage of the scalability of the cloud at that point. It's really just a virtual machine that's sitting out in the cloud. Another option is cloud services. We started supporting this a little while ago. This is actually using the scalability of the cloud, so you can put this out on cloud services, quickly change the configuration of it, run a deploy, and you're good to go. You don't have to log in a remote desktop and do anything manually. We've got 3 ways to actually do a deployment with cloud services. Sitefinity Thunder will do that for you. It is a different process, which I'll show you how that works. We have PowerShell scripts, which was written by one of our engineers that actually allows you to create a script, essentially, that's really doing what Sitefinity Thunder is doing behind the scenes, but you can do it yourself with a PowerShell script. It does give you a lot more control at that point, because with Thunder, you couldn't say, hey, I want to also deploy a scheduled task and set this up and point it to this PowerShell script so it automatically runs. Thunder's not going to let you do that. But with a PowerShell script, you can code that in and say, hey, I want to use WinRM. If you're familiar with WinRM, it's a PowerShell utility for remoting into a machine. You can remote into that Azure environment, set up that scheduled task immediately upon deployment, and get that going. Couldn't do that with Thunder. And then obviously there's the manual deployment, which is essentially you have to go into your Sitefinity project, change your data config, change your web config, change your settings. There's a lot of stuff you have to do. It's kind of annoying. And then you have to create a package and deploy that manually. Do not recommend going that route if you can avoid it. Additionally, when you run any of these tools, it's going to modify your files. Data config, web config, like I mentioned. Make sure you go in there and revert your changes out. Sitefinity Thunder gives you a checkbox that says revert changes. It doesn't always work. So if you're hooked to source control or something, like TFI, I'm hooked to Visual Studio Online. If Sitefinity Thunder modifies those files, I can just do undo pending changes, and then it wipes those changes out that it made. Because you don't want to deploy those changes locally, because then your database or your configuration is then stored in the database, which is a requirement of Azure Cloud Services. Okay, and Azure or web apps. Again, we have PowerShell scripts for that. I put the link down here if you guys want to open that up. I've actually used these. They work great. I can kind of kick one off just to show you, but as soon as I do that, my Sitefinity Indy Summit site's going to go down. So you can go out there and look at those. I'll do that at the end. You can also do a manual deployment with Visual Studio. What? That's true. I don't have it set up for that. You could do manual deployments with Visual Studio, which would require you to, again, make those manual changes in your project and then do the deployment. It's a little bit more cumbersome. Definitely recommend going the PowerShell or Sitefinity Thunder route for both. Me, myself, I like PowerShell scripts. I just like having control over it. And we do support those now. They're on our documentation as well. And let's hold off on this demo. Who has tried doing a deployment of Sitefinity using Thunder? OK. I'm not going to run through the whole deployment. I'll just show you essentially how you set your project up for it. And I'm going to do one quick change. I'm going to undo all my pending changes in my project here. Get back to my baseline. OK. So if you have Sitefinity Thunder installed, you can come in and actually right-click on your Sitefinity web app project and click on Deploy Sitefinity to Windows Azure. There is some knowledge you will need to have of Azure to be able to do this. So if this isn't working properly for you, it's probably because there's a little bit of knowledge lacking around the Azure side of things, that we're not knowing, hey, what this setting is actually doing. So I definitely recommend reading up on how cloud services work. but this will allow you to automatically set the project up. It's going to change your config files for you, migrate the database. It's actually going to take a backpack of your SQL local database or network database, and it's going to create a backup of that, and it's going to deploy that for you and automatically update your connection string to point to that in Azure. Checking the published Sitefinity project to Azure is actually going to take that package file it generates, and it's going to push it out to the Azure deployment so it can install that. And then this revert changes to the local Sitefinity project is supposed to revert the changes. Don't trust it. Use source control. Make sure. You know what? I'm not going through that local script database portion because that's going to take too long. Let's just deploy the project. But you saw it popped up with a little message saying it was generating the scripts. That works fine. Let's just do that. Okay. So the very first step when you have a Azure project you need to deploy is you need this publish settings file. This publish settings file is what essentially allows you to connect to that Azure account, not the cloud service, because it's going to create the Azure account. You need to be able to have privileges to create cloud services, create a database in Azure. So you need to make sure that you actually have credentials for that. But if you do have permissions for it, then you can click this, which will essentially take you to the site to download that publish settings file. Mine's probably going to ask me to sign in. We'll see. It's going to it knows what accounts you're signed in. If you're not signed in, it's going to ask you to. And it's going to automatically download this file right here, which it just did. I have my publish settings file. For those of you who can't see that, it's down there, I promise. You take this file, and you can actually import it into Sitefinity Thunder now, which I have already done, but I can come into import. Where'd that go? Downloads. I guess you can see that I've created like 100 of them. Let's go to, that one's fine. It's going to import that file. I click next, and now I can do some of the settings. So it's going to automatically pull in some of the data. It knows about my Azure account. It knows that I already have a cloud service out there. So instead of creating a new one, I can just update the cloud service that's already existing. And it also knows that I have a number of storage accounts already existing out there. So I can just select the storage account that I was already using. The next step is going to ask me for essentially how beefy is this environment going to be. So I can come up and set the instances count, which is essentially how many like worker roles are behind this. If you do set this to 2 or more, Azure is actually going to use load balancing behind the scenes. Sitefinity will need to then have load balancing enabled, so you'll need NLB for Sitefinity. But you can have 4 instances. That's essentially 4 load balance machines in cloud services speak. Virtual machine size, this is specific to Windows Azure. This is going to dictate the hard drive size, the memory, the CPU, all the different resources that you have available to you in Azure. So what you can do is actually go out to the Azure Cloud Services pricing page, and it lists out each one of these, and it tells you what you get with that package. Small is usually perfectly fine for a pretty simple Sitefinity site, but if you have one that's getting a significant amount of traffic, you might want to up that because this is controlling the CPU, and then you may even need to go to a load balance type mode. Okay. And remote desktop, if you want to be able to remote into your environment after it creates it, because cloud services will create a virtual machine in the background. If you want to be able to remote into that and do stuff, you can come in and actually set up remote desktop credentials. Once you have done that, if I click the next button, it's going to package this up and deploy it. Again, that takes a while, so I'm not going to do it. But I will show you my Azure account. So once you've set up those credentials for remote desktop, it's not going to be as easy as just going to remote desktop and going, okay, I want to go indiesummit.cloudapp.net, username, password. The reason being is you actually have the machine name, and it's not that indiesummit.cloudapp.net. So what you can do is come into your instances, click on Connect, and it's automatically going to download a remote desktop file for you. And all I have to do is plug in my password for the user I set up. Okay. Got about 7 minutes left. Let's jump back to the slides. Okay, so aside from deployment, there's some other things in Azure that you can actually take advantage of. Search services is a really nice one for sites that have output cache set correctly, their warm-up, their pre-compiler, everything's good, but they have a complex search utility. And those are going to be completely dynamic requests. You can't really cache that very easily. Database will do some help there, but not much. What you can do to help with the environment CPU and the speed is actually push those search services off to a third party. Obviously, we have Elastic. We also have Azure as one of the services you can do. Azure is nice because it, like Elasticsearch, it supports facets and filters, and it's easily customizable. With the 7.3 release, we changed the way search works. We have search services now, and you can very easily just create a new search service or customize the one that's out there to include filters or facets. I did a project recently where I actually allowed you to do Geo Distance Search. So someone plugged in their zip code. I had zip code matches in the database, and I was able, with Azure, it had this support. Sitefinity didn't use it, but I was able to make it determine the lat and lon for those zip codes and actually determine the distance. So I could say, retrieve our results within 10 miles or 20 miles or whatever. Also supports storage providers. So this is another area you can actually improve the system a little bit. If you have a site that's going to be distributed, let's say you have it out in the cloud, but you just have your resources sitting locally, and you have people visiting the site from Japan, China, Europe, US, everywhere. The CDN storage for this, or using the storage provider with a CDN endpoint, is actually nice because it offers the support for putting that in a geological area nearest the user coming to the site. And the CDN does that automatically for you behind the scenes. This is actually a really easy thing to set up. There's just config settings. You plug in your Azure storage name, your credentials, and it will move it to Azure with a flip of a switch. There's actually a button that says move to another storage, and you can just click that. You'll get a progress bar that'll pop up, and it'll go through. Nice thing there is, again, when you're accessing images, documents, and videos on the local machine, if those aren't already in cache, or maybe they exceed the amount that cache will do, Sitefinity output cache will only store 500 kilobytes. So if your PDF file sitting in the document library is 2 meg, that's not getting cached. It's going to hit it every time. That's actually another setting in the output cache settings. You can up that amount, but by default, I think it's 500 kilobyte. So what's nice about this, if you do have some really large files, it's smart to put it out there on Azure because you can offload those requests and keep your performance of your web server pretty clean. Okay, and Redis support. This is something we just launched in 8.2. We are not fully supporting Redis quite yet across its entire board of what it can offer. But we are supporting it for NLB communication. So what that does, and essentially what it means to you, is if you are using Redis, Redis is specific to Azure Web Apps or websites. And if you have 3 instances inside of Azure Web Apps, so you're kind of doing load balancing with 3 instances, with Redis, you don't need to go in and set up Sitefinity so that it knows about every single node. It doesn't have to know about node1.mysite.com, node2.mysite.com, and node3.mysite.com. Redis is taking care of that for you behind the scenes. It's kind of hiding the load balancing behind Sitefinity. Other thing it adds is automatic scalability support. You can configure Azure Web Apps to basically say, hey, if my CPU gets to 70%, bump it up. You can actually increase resources as the site's running without you having to do anything. Without Redis, you can't do that. Okay. And there is something that's actually very exciting. We haven't got it yet. It's coming soon. Redis Cache. It's called Redis Cache in Azure, but it's Redis Output Cache. What that allows you to do is, let me back up. If you have a load balance environment, you have 2 nodes. They each have their own instance of output cache because they each have their own memory. If you were using a warm-up script on those, you'd have to warm up node 1 and warm up node 2 because depending on where the user is getting routed, you don't know if that's going to be in cache or not, right? So in a standard load balancing scenario, you would have to run that warm-up script on both nodes. That's pretty standard. With Redis Cache, it tells Sitefinity whenever you're using output cache, store it in Redis and point both environments to that. So the environments no longer have their own instance of output cache. They're pointing to an external location. What's nice about that is you now only have to run the warm-up script on one location. It's going to increase your CPU, or it's going to decrease your CPU usage because you no longer have to worry about something not being in cache on 2 environments because if it's done on one, it's automatically taken care of on both. Again, this isn't released yet, but it is something that is coming soon. We're working on it. We have code that's being written for it. Being not on the product team, I don't have an answer for you. But if you want to shoot me an email, I can ping those guys and see if they have it on a docket or a roadmap yet. And I'm right at the end, so I'm actually going to leave it open for Q&A. At the same moment, I'm actually going to run a Azure PowerShell script so you can see that working. So let's come to C drive, Azure PowerShell. I added all my scripts here. Again, you get this whole package when you download it off of that GitHub repo. We're going to open PowerShell as administrator. That's important. I'm going to set my execution policy here so that this script has the ability to run other scripts, because if I don't, it's going to ask me, do you want to run this? Yes. Do you want to run this one? Yes. This allows me to bypass that, and it'll just run it without me telling it to. I just have to tell it, yes, I want to do this, and now I'm good. Azure PowerShell, C scripts. And we're going to do this clean command, which I have saved the command line for. So theoretically, if all works correctly, this is calling out to Azure. It's going to delete my database. It's going to delete my cloud service. It's going to clean out my storage container so that I can then do a nice, new, fresh deployment. And just so you know, it's not as easy as just calling this command. There are config files that you have to set settings in for all this to run correctly. If you come out there and just try to set the parameters, it's not going to know what it's doing. Thanks. Mm-hmm. 8.1 to 8.2. So if you're doing a minor change like that, the only thing that would cause me to use the project manager. So who's familiar with doing upgrades to the project manager? Okay, the project manager goes through, it replaces the DLL files, it updates the web config with any changes, right? And I think I was just talking to you earlier about this. I don't like using the project manager for doing upgrades completely because I like to have control over the DLL files. So what I would do is I use that project manager just for the web config changes, and it'll actually tell me what's changed. I can get a nice little scroll bar to see the diff file between the two. I use it for that, and then I immediately come into my project. And are you using the NuGet packages on Sitefinity? Okay. Let me zoom out of this real quick. This is cool. I'll do one more show of hands. Who's using the NuGet packages on Sitefinity? Okay, so not as much as some of the other things. You go to nuget.sitefinity.com. This contains every NuGet package that Sitefinity provides. And there is this telarc.sitefinity.all package. And we do it for every version, every internal build. So if there's a hotfix that we put out there, it will be in this list. And you can see right now we've got 8.2 out there. This is essentially the entire bin folder of the Sitefinity web app project. So what you can literally do is you can delete the bin folder in your project, which will break all your references. That's fine. Install package telarc.sitefinity.all, pass in the version, and it's going to install your project to rely on the NuGet packages. So with that in place, what I do is I'll use the project manager for the web config. I'll come into my project in Visual Studio. I'll do an update package, telarc.sitefinity.all, to 8.2 versus 8.1. And it's going to go through and replace all my references, which if I set my pointers up right, all of my external projects are automatically going to have the references automatically upgraded. My Sitefinity web app 1 will have its references upgraded too. So you won't have all those reference issues that I know a lot of people run into when they're doing upgrades. That's the nice thing about NuGet. And as soon as you've done that, you can run it in a web page, and you're going to get that, in 8.2 now, you're going to get that page that's going to tell you what it did to the database during the upgrade. As far as how often, it really depends on your scenario. How often are you guys making changes? Like development work. Development work. Okay. Yeah. At that point, I would probably upgrade. And the only reason is because I know in 7.0, 7.1, and I think even 7.2, we had some significant performance improvements. And that isn't just a feature. That's like the performance of your website. Aside from that, just watch the release notes if there's something you want to take advantage of. For anybody out there, 8.2 is awesome. With the system recycle message and the messages with the upgrades, we actually have a performance page inside of the application now too that reviews your setting in your project and says, hey, you have your web config, in your web config you have your debug property set to true, which if you have that, that actually is an overhead for performance. This new performance page in 8.2 tells you that. It gives you like almost like a review of your performance settings. It's not going to do the caching stuff I talked about earlier, but it will give you some baseline stuff. So for things like that, which are just general improvements to the product, personally, I'd take advantage of them immediately. You know, if you get used to doing upgrades, they're not so scary. But if it's a scenario where, hey, in this version, there wasn't any real general releases, it was just they added this translations module and we don't need this translations module, then I wouldn't worry about it. But I would probably try to stay at least every whole version in the project. Yeah. So this, the going through and making sure everything's still working, right? What I would recommend there, and really this is up to whoever kind of manages that project, but they can either decide, hey, we're going to regression test this and spend a week doing this, or you can try to come up with some really cool automated tests that are going to run against your builds to make sure things are still working. That's what I would probably recommend. If you're doing regression testing, the chances are it's probably a pretty big project, and if there's a significant amount of time that goes into that, it's probably a big project, and it probably could benefit from automated tests. Oh yeah, I'd probably do automated tests in that circumstance, because you don't want to click through every single page 15 times. Any other questions on that? Otherwise, let me finish off this last command here. That way you know I'm not lying to you. Oh, and if I didn't break my project, this should work. I tested it like 5 times this morning, so let's hope it actually goes through. So the first thing is it's verifying that my publish settings is correct. This still is running off of the publish settings behind the scenes. Now it's going through and it's actually processing all the tables in my local database. The next thing it's going to do is actually create a backup of that, and it's going to create a deployment package for the database. It'll deploy it, and then it'll actually build my project using MS Build. One thing I have noticed, or I ran into with this, is it is configured to use the latest version of Azure you have installed on your machine. And this is actually not part of our custom code with this. This is the way it works with MS Build. They have a parameter where you can override that. But the concern is Sitefinity right now is built off of 2.6. If you have 2.7 in your machine, you try to do an MS Build against 2.7, deploy that, you're going to get a big error message, and it's probably going to be really confusing. So if you run into that, just know that you need to come into these PowerShell scripts and add a parameter that specifically tells it where to get the version of Azure SDK they want to use.